Today we will be dealing with the infamous Leviticus 25, 44-46 passage. Let's begin by reading through the text. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. This passage stands in contrast to the laws that have come before concerning the treatment of an Israelite who has fallen further and further into poverty. In verse 25, if one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. In verse 35, if any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger, so they can continue to live among you. So the Israelite has sold his property and still cannot make ends meet. If his fellow Israelites lend him financial support, but even this falls short, in verse 39 we see, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Bernard Levinson, in the 2005 article in the Journal of Biblical Literature, argued that Leviticus 25 was written to essentially turn Exodus 21 on its head with respect to the laws about slavery. If you remember, Exodus 21 says that you can have Hebrew slaves, and you must release them after 6 years of service. However, here in Leviticus 25, we see that Israelites were not to treat their fellow Israelites as slaves, but rather as hired workers. So the question arises, if an Israelite cannot have another Israelite serve as a slave, who will? Verse 44, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. In other words, Leviticus 25 is making circumstances better for the Israelites who fall into poverty. If you want to own a slave, you can no longer get them from the Israelites. They must come from the nations around you, or from foreign residents living among you. Levinson writes, Section 2 of the law sanctions what Section 1 prohibits, holding slaves as chattel, but restricts such slaveholding to non-Israelite slaves taken from the nations round you. This demonstrates the textual reworking that permits Leviticus 25 to restrict the purchase, ownership, and inheritance of slaves to the category of foreigners. Even Daisy Tsai, in her 2014 monograph, Human Rights in Deuteronomy, with special focus on slave laws, agrees. An Israelite slave should never be treated as property per se, but only as belonging to Yahweh. As a result, Leviticus 25, 44-46 clarifies that if one wants to possess permanent slaves as their inherited property that may be bequeathed to his children, he can acquire aliens or the sojourners among Israel. If an Israelite wants to obtain a permanent slave as an inheritable property for their children, he can only buy it among the non-Israelite. In short, if an Israelite wanted to own a slave, Leviticus 25 restricts them to only purchasing foreigners. They could no longer treat Israelites as slaves. Now that we have a handle on what the passage is talking about, let's get into some of the details. There are a couple of things from the Hebrew that are worth noting in the discussion. First, earlier in this video, 𝑀 referred to the toshav and the ger in verse 45. Actually, the word ger does not appear in this verse. The form that he put on the screen, garim, comes from the verb gar, meaning to live or sojourn. Here, it is acting as an adjectival participle, which means who are living or the ones living. This is not to say that the common hendiadys ger v'toshav is not implied here, only that the form hagarim does not refer to the plural for ger. So, who are the toshavim? Well, that's tricky. In 2014, Yoram Meshar at Hebrew University Jerusalem wrote an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature entitled, Who Was the Toshav? The article concluded that it refers to a tenant farmer, one who works the land that he does not own himself, but pays rent to the owner of the field, keeping the surplus for himself. While Meshar's conclusions may be correct, the important point for our discussion is that identifying the specific nature of the toshav is not straightforward. In fact, terms for foreigners in the Hebrew Bible tend to take nuanced meanings in different passages. In 2011, an entire edited volume was dedicated to this topic, entitled The Foreigner and the Law: Perspectives from the Hebrew Bible and the Ancient Near East. What we can say, however, is that these are certainly not Israelites, but foreigners who are residing in the land on a long-term basis. Thus, the idea that the foreigners from the nations around and the alien residents or tenant farmers living in the land would have no land to return to after their release is simply inaccurate. The reality is that slaves in the ancient world were extraordinarily common, and biblical law allowed for Israelites to purchase slaves from these foreign nations, who were most likely debt slaves who had fallen into the hands of their foreign creditors, who had the right to sell them. It is also quite likely that the tenant farmers living in the land had taken loans and fallen into debt slavery. These, as opposed to the Israelites, could be kept indefinitely. There was no law requiring their release. Furthermore, the idea that the foreigner would want to come to Israel to serve as a permanent slave, or would want to leave their free resident alien status to become a slave, is not only not present in the passage, but it goes against the very nature of the text itself. The entire point of Leviticus 25 is to emphasize that making someone an eved, a slave, and keeping them indefinitely is an undesirable situation. You cannot treat fellow Israelites in that way. If you want slaves, you need to get them from people who are not your brethren. Thus, when we examine the context of Leviticus 25, 44-46, we see several things. First, chapter 25 focuses on the year of Jubilee, and the release of property and individuals after a set period of time. In this context, the text describes an Israelite who falls into poverty and how other Israelites are to treat him. If the destitute Israelite must sell himself to another Israelite, the master must not treat him as a slave, but as a hired worker. If an Israelite wants to purchase a slave, therefore, he must do so from among the nations around, or the foreign residents in the land. These can be treated as slaves, and can be kept as permanent property, passed on to their children as inheritance.